thanks very much for being with us. And I'm pleased to introduce to you Mike Roosevelt. Mike graduated with a BA in history from Furman University and earned a master's in Russian history from Penn State University. He worked as an analyst and a manager at the Central Intelligence Agency for 30 years, retiring as a member of Senior Intelligence Service in 2015. He was brought on with the CIA for his expertise on the Soviet Union, and he analyzed the politics of Russia and other Soviet successor states throughout his career, but also took on assignments focused on China, global crime and narcotics, interagency policy coordination, human resources, and the Office of the Inspector General. He was Joe Biden's first intelligence briefer after the 2008 presidential election. Personally, now that he's back in Greenville, I learned from his LinkedIn page, and I'm really nervous about this because, what I just read to you, he wrote, and I knew I was safe. And I'm on thin ice now because, I'm afraid that if I say anything that's at all classified, you're going to all of a sudden hear, whoop, 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 whoop. There's going to be a helicopter. There's going to be guys in black suits that are going to rappel down. They're going to come through these doors, and I'll be gone. And so my wife's back there, so I'm going to tell him to take you too. So I'm on thin ice on saying this because this has not been cleared. But after retiring, he's spending his time teaching folks how to communicate more effectively with their bosses, riding his bike on the back roads of South Carolina, and volunteering with Habitat for Humanity, Harvest Hope Food Bank, and voter registration efforts. So we're welcoming him and appreciate his service and interested in hearing about Russia and the Soviet collapse. Mike.
Well, Bob, thank you very much for having me here. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, and thank you to your members for having me here today. It's nice to see so many people here interested in the end of the Soviet Union. It was meaningful to me, and I imagine a lot of you remember some tidbits from it as well. Some of you will probably know more about it than I do. So this gives me a chance to relive the earliest days of my career. So I'm planning on having some fun. My focus is going to be on what I saw as an analyst in real time as these things were happening. And I'm also going to try to, wherever possible, cite official CIA publications that have been declassified, because I don't want the helicopter descending on me either. We signed secrecy agreements after we retire, and I don't want to test it. And so there's that. This was a tough one for me to prepare for, too, because I was so close to it for so many years that I could easily spend a semester's worth of time just talking about this topic. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to try to keep my comments to about a half an hour with some ad-libs added in there. And then we'll leave some time for Q&A as well. So I'm going to try really, really hard to stay on point. So, a theme for this talk. If you saw this slide earlier, that Bob just happened to hit the forward arrow. This is not going to be a literature class. So my fellow Furman grads back there, don't have flashbacks to Rudy Bates. We're not going to be talking about Ernest Hemingway here, but this is a passage from The Sun Also Rises that summarizes the points I really want to make today. Short passage. How did you go bankrupt? Bankrupt, Bill asked. 2 ways, Mike said, gradually and then suddenly. That is, if you don't remember anything else about this talk, that's how the Soviet Union fell apart. Gradually and then very, very suddenly. So, before I really get started here, a little coincidence, or was it a coincidence? On the 11th of March, 1986, you may have seen on your TV some version of Ted Koppel announcing the appointment, the election of a new leader in the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev. His predecessor had died the day before. He was elected by the Politburo and installed the next day. So on the 11th, Monday, the 11th of March, 1985, he became the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Why do I remember that it was a Monday? Because on that very day, this guy was in the CIA building for the very first time interviewing for a job with the people who would be hiring him, and all hell was breaking loose in the office, and I thought, oh my God, I want to be a part of this. It was so exciting to be there while it was happening, and the decisions about what they were going to say were being made. You can tell that that's not a fake picture of me, because you might see the Entertainment Tonight logo in the corner. So if it says I'm CIA on Entertainment Tonight, it must be true. So was it a coincidence? How many people here read spy novels, watch spy movies? Yeah, of course, a whole lot. There are no coincidences. That was supposed to be a laugh line. Okay. Now seriously, folks, 6 years later, by 1991, I had been practicing the dark art of criminology for 6 years. I did things like examine pictures like this, or video, on May Day and November 7th, when they would have their big military parades through Red Square commemorating May Day, Workers' Day, and the October Revolution. Of course, the Russians celebrate the October Revolution in November. Contrary to what you might think, I had very little classified information to work from. Classified resources were dedicated to other things, primarily defense, naturally, and other issues. But we were reliant very heavily on the unclassified Soviet press, what we saw on television, what we read in the newspapers, things like that. So we would study pictures like this and video. We would read Soviet obituaries. Really, you're saying? What do obituaries tell you? Well, the Soviets had a formula for an obituary. It would tell you the name, it would tell you their dates, it would tell you the jobs that they had had throughout their career. Sometimes they left some out, and what they left out was just as important as what they put in. But then at the very end, this is a very Soviet, very Russian custom, they signed obituaries. Leaders signed it. So the if this was an important person, the General Secretary of the Communist Party would sign it first. And then in descending rank order, other officials would sign it. And that's how we criminologists would figure out what this person really did throughout his career, where he had been, who he had worked with, what sectors, for instance, of the economy or the military-industrial complex he, usually a he, or she had been a member of. So this was really, it was tea leaves reading. So I wanted to explain that. My wife thought this was fascinating. She had forgotten all about this, so I had to tell her. She goes, you need to include that in your talk. I don't want to say that I was a criminology nerd or a Soviet politics nerd, but shortly after I got married, my wife's father was a TV critic for the Louisville Courier-Journal, back when local newspapers still did their own stuff. And he had this cool new invention called a VCR. And he would record TV shows that he could replay and write his critiques. And I asked him, I said, Jim, would you mind taping the funeral of Andropov for me in 1984? And he looked at me like, what has my daughter gotten into here? But that was the kind of stuff that we looked at. So after 6 years of doing this kind of stuff, I still enjoyed it, but I was wearing a little thin. I needed a change. So I had gotten myself a job following Chinese foreign policy, and I was about to start the assignment. I had 1 week left in the Office of Soviet Analysis. Surprise! I walk in on Monday, and Gorbachev has been couped. He's in his little Crimean dacha on his summer vacation with his family, and a group calling themselves the Committee for the State of Emergency had gone down to Crimea and informed him that he was no longer the leader of the Soviet Union, that they were in charge now. The committee would take over, and they were going to preserve communism that he was ruining. So that happened on my first day of my last week, and I'm thinking, oh, maybe I shouldn't leave. But believe me, I did, and it was the right decision. Anyway, in fairly short order, how many of y'all remember this? August 1991. This was a Monday, like Tuesday. Remember this picture? Yeltsin on the tank in downtown, in central Moscow, defying the coup plotters, saying this is not going to happen. Remember that? Well, okay, by Thursday, the coup had failed. Gorbachev was brought back to Moscow. Everything's back to normal, right? Wrong. Wrong. Keep in mind, this will be important later, and it will be on the test. Yeltsin was really good at defying the coup plotters, and he brought back Gorbachev and restored him to his former position, but the power dynamic had shifted in that time. These were two rivals for power. Yeltsin had been elected president of Russia just a couple months before the coup. He was the first elected president of the Russian Republic. And he didn't really care so much about the Soviet Union, let's say. He cared about Russia, and he cared about Boris Yeltsin. So these two rivals were going to duke it out for a few months, and by Christmas 1991, this is what the headline said. The Soviet Union had ceased to exist. On Christmas Day, it collapsed. By the way, if I mention somebody or something and I'm unclear, raise a hand and give me a shout. Let me know if I need to clarify something. So how did we get there? How did we get to a point where the multi-ethnic Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, comprised of 15 constituent republics, how did it just fall apart so suddenly? How did we get to a point where you would see a street scene like this in Moscow, where citizens were reduced to selling their goods, their possessions, to try to make ends meet, to try to buy food, to try to pay their rent, to try to get by from day to day? How did we get there? Think back to that time. Remember the Soviets, the projection of the Soviets were on the move. They were dynamic. The dominoes were falling and things like that. Things had been going their way for a while. Remember, they exploded a hydrogen bomb in 1953. The Sputnik launch in 1957. The Czech and Hungarian invasions in 1956, the invasions in 1956, 1968, suppressing popular revolts against communist oppression. The invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, deposing the leaders there and installing a Soviet puppet regime. The military parades that I mentioned earlier. Remember those big, they parade the missiles and the tanks, and the troops would goose step down Red Square, all very, very impressive. A real show of military might. And the other thing, maybe just a little bit more of an image thing, kind of a dynamic, vigorous leadership. Remember Brezhnev and his eyebrows? This is him in better days. But that was kind of the image that we had, that they were moving. And in the meantime, what's the lasting image of the West, especially the United States? Late 70s, early 80s. We're kind of in retreat. We're a little bit on our back foot as a nation. We don't want to get involved in foreign adventures. We had one of those in the early 70s, late 60s, and it didn't work out so well. So this is kind of the image. I know I'm oversimplifying. I had to leave a lot of stuff out. So the reality, though, for the Soviets, a long, slow decline. Remember that Ernest Hemingway slide? Gradually. It was not a fast thing. Remember this guy? Young, dynamic, sporty Brezhnev. Well, he became this guy. He stayed too long. That's the thing. Soviet leaders rarely retired. And when they did retire, it was usually not their choice to retire. But when the retirement plan was death. Brezhnev had been in declining health for years, arguably had dementia. I've seen video. I wish I could have found it, but I couldn't, despite my best efforts. of literally people holding him up off camera so he didn't fall over. But with the weight of all those medals, of course he would fall over. But he became this guy. He stayed too long. He died just a few days after the November Revolution Day parade in 1982. Okay, great. So you say he'll be replaced by this guy, KGB chief, Yuri Andropov. Had been the KGB chief for over 20 years, had been key to suppressing the revolution in Hungary in 1956, had repressed dissidents in the Soviet Union for years, but the word on the street in the West was he liked jazz and scotch, so we could work with him. He also had terminal kidney disease. He was dead in a year. He was replaced by a young guy, right? Wrong. He was replaced by this guy who had all kinds of ailments. His primary qualification for the job was he had been Brezhnev's drinking buddy. He had emphysema. He was dead in a year. Okay, time for a reset, Soviets. You need to do something here. So what would they do? Before I get there, part of the decline, this aging, decrepit leadership was a bit of a metaphor for other things slowing down. The economy was sputtering along. I was pleasantly surprised when I found this graphic. This is a graphic of income growth over time, from Stalin's time to the end of the 80s. The blue bar are official Soviet estimates. So remember the old 5-year plans? They would falsify the data. So sky-high results, especially during the early years of Stalin. The red bars are CIA estimates. Some of them are retroactive, but you can see considerably lower than the Soviet estimates. And the green bar were done by a Russian economist in the late 80s, and he was using a lot of official data. And for the most part, you'll see his estimates are the lowest of all. It doesn't matter which color bar you look at. Even the Soviets were projecting lower growth for themselves. So you had that. This translated to kind of a daily slog at home for the average Soviet citizen. Remember pictures and video of bread lines, things like that in Moscow? Anybody actually see them ever? You could see them on tourist visits and things like that. They didn't like it when you saw them, but you could see them. The good news, when you got to the head of the line though, right? You had first pick of nothing. A lot of times the shelves were empty. So it was a barter economy in some cases. I'll stand in line for shoes if you stand in line for vodka, if you stand in line for bread, and we'll do some swapping, things like that. So not exactly the dynamic image that had been portrayed. They had a few problems abroad too. This picture happens to be of a bunch of mujahideen in Afghanistan having a little picnic around a Soviet helicopter that they shot down. So this sort of complemented the problems they were having at home. Things were just as difficult abroad. So things were not so rosy in March of 1985 when Chernenko died. Enter Gorbachev. He's making his first appearance here. Let me talk briefly about let me characterize Gorbachev for you in just a few seconds. A different kind of a Soviet leader. True, he had been brought up through the traditional system. He had checked all the boxes. And in fact, when he became the head of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, he had been in charge of agriculture in the Soviet Union, which is not exactly the way to get ahead. It is a colossal opportunity to fail. Somehow he managed to parlay it into success. He was 3 decades younger than a lot of his colleagues, had a lot of dynamism, and he had seen firsthand the problems that the Soviets were facing. He and a lot of his like-minded reform colleagues saw opportunities, huge opportunities to change. So what did he want to do? I've narrowed it down to a few things. He wanted to reinvigorate the party. The party, in his estimation, was hidebound, had been kind of resistant to change for too long, had too many people in leadership positions who needed to be put out to pasture. He wanted to reform the economy. Remember perestroika? It meant restructuring. He wanted to restructure the Soviet economy. He wanted to normalize foreign relations, specifically put things on an even footing, especially with the West, especially with the United States, and as you'll see, especially on the subject of arms control. He wanted to open up society. Good old glasnost. Remember openness, glasnost? Review the things that were going on that were holding back Soviet progress. Open up historical debates again. Publish books that were controversial. Let people talk about the problems that were existent in the Soviet Union. And finally, excuse me, he wanted to address a lot of long-simmering ethnic tensions and disputes throughout the Soviet Union. All good goals, all good objectives, but I don't think that Gorbachev and his like-minded reformers ever really understood fully the depth of the rot in the Soviet system. It seems easy for us to see it in hindsight now. A lot of us could say we saw it at the time, but if you're in it, it's really, if you grew up in that system, it's really hard to admit, oh, we got some real problems here. They knew they had problems, but I don't think even Gorbachev understood how bad they were. So how did he do? Well, you already know the answer. It's kind of a spoiler alert here. But how did he do? And that's where I want to spend most of my remaining comments. Whenever possible, as I said at the top, I will cite official CIA publications to illustrate my points. So let's talk about something that was a relative success first, because it's kind of the end of the story for success. Normalizing foreign relations. I've got an asterisk on that one because that was, it was a hot debate in U.S. leadership and analytic circles. How serious are these initiatives that Gorbachev is making? How serious of a reformer is he? Or is he just a communist in disguise, trying to lure us into a trap that he could spring on us when we drop our guard? So that's what the asterisk is for. First success. The summit meetings that he had with the U.S. administration, famously meeting in Reykjavik with President Reagan. He met in Malta and the U.S. with George H.W. Bush. So there were several iterations of these, and also huge, huge initiatives to reduce nuclear stockpiles. So I would judge that a success. He also got the Soviet Union out of Afghanistan. People might say this was an admission of failure, but he was cutting his losses. He got out of Afghanistan in, I think, late in '89 was kind of the end of that. So end the successes. Now let's get to the meat and potatoes here. Reinvigorating the party. Good luck with that. This is the face, these are the faces of the party that he was trying to reinvigorate. Whoops, I didn't want to go that far. These guys are typical. KGB chief, Politburo member, you might remember the guy at the top middle, Andrei Gromyko, the longtime foreign minister. He had been around since Stalin. Okay? He'd been around for 50 years at that point. So anyway, Gorbachev had a monumental task trying to reinvigorate this party. They were skeptical of innovation, very skeptical of reform, especially anything that challenged the Soviet economic model, but then challenging the primacy of the party as well. Big landmines for Gorbachev. This is an assessment in hindsight. This is from Robert Gates' testimony during his confirmation hearings for the position of CIA director in 1991. He's reflecting back on 1986. Gorbachev could not carry out a process of democratization and leave the Communist Party structure and the national security structure, including the KGB, intact. So right there, one of those landmines. He was trying to do too many things, balance the interests of the party while changing it. It was very, very difficult for him to do that. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Reforming the economy. Really? A couple of nice cartoons here that I think illustrate the conundrum that Gorbachev faced. Mikhail Gorbachev, transformer designer, it says. This is a Western cartoon. Soviet cartoons were funny, but only to Soviets. So you're not going to see any of those. These are Western cartoons, but this illustrates his problem on the economy really nicely. How do you balance the demands of the military economy and the consumer economy? Step one, how do I get the tank to a washer and dryer for the consumers? And a lot of question marks between steps 1 and 6 there. So I thought that illustrated his problem very nicely. Just to reinforce that point, he was riding a dinosaur. The economy was a relic of Stalinist times. So yeah, here, the dashing new jockey Gorbachev and his sleek thoroughbred. Not a promising objective. I mean, the challenges here, the stressors, in addition to things just slowing down, the economic slowdown, unmotivated workforce, a parasitic Soviet bureaucracy, rampant corruption, a variety of criminal activities and a black market, alcoholism, civil unrest, these were all part of the recipe confronting Gorbachev as he tried to reform the economy. Assessing the challenge, this from a CIA assessment in September 1985. So Gorbachev had only been in charge for a few months when we wrote this. The Soviet economy cannot simultaneously maintain rapid growth in defense spending, satisfy demand for greater quantity and variety of consumer goods and services, invest the amounts required for economic modernization and expansion, and continue to support client state economies. So a huge, huge challenge that he faced here, trying to juggle all those things at the same time. Opening up society, the trouble with glasnost. It was manifest, the problems here. Now, glasnost was really popular among the average Soviet citizen, especially younger Soviets and Soviets who had had families, say, persecuted during Stalin's purges in the 30s. Yeah, let's open up the archives. Let's look into our history. Let's talk about those dark periods that we lived through or didn't live through. So they were very popular with certain segments of society, a little less so with other more orthodox communist, more traditional Communist Party members. But they also opened a Pandora's box for Gorbachev. Because if you could open things up to examination, nothing was out of bounds, right? You could question the party and its primacy. You could do a raspberry at the general secretary while he was speaking if you wanted to. Well, I recommend not doing that. Yeltsin kind of tried it in 1987, and it initially did not work out too well for him. Anyway, there were several areas that glasnost had a huge, huge impact on. Socially, it exposed unforced errors, problems of their own making that didn't need to be problems. The first one I'll use is kind of a silly one. In case you're wondering, that's a well-groomed young Soviet lad saying "niet" to a glass of vodka. Gorbachev launched a ridiculously ill-considered anti-alcoholism campaign. It was a disaster. How are you going to tell Soviets they can't drink? I mean, okay, I'm going to stop there so I don't say anything too offensive. But needless to say, this did not work. It was a colossal, unforced error that they didn't have to commit. A bigger unforced error. April 1986, the explosion at the Chernobyl nuclear plant in Ukraine. A colossal disaster that they initially tried to cover up, right? Because nothing bad can happen in Soviet industry. It's the greatest industry of all. It revealed shortcuts, mistakes. This was an illustration for everything that was wrong with Soviet industry. And unfortunately, it's kind of a blueprint for the way the Russian government still handles disasters to this day. I mean, think about the terrorist attack in Moscow or outside of Moscow just a couple weeks ago. We still don't know the full truth about that because they're afraid to tell us what really happened. So big, big unforced errors, some silly, some very grave. It fueled trouble outside of Moscow. It wasn't just a leadership problem. It brought to the surface long simmering ethnic disputes. This was an ethnic riot in a suburb of the capital of Azerbaijan, where Azerbaijanis massacred ethnic Armenians. This was the beginning of a civil war in Georgia, in downtown Tbilisi, the capital. This was a demonstration in Kazakhstan that turned very violent in December 1986 when the Soviet central authorities in Moscow attempted to replace the longtime Kazakh head of the republic with an ethnic Russian. And the locals took exception, extreme exception. And this just is to illustrate the independence movements that were brewing throughout the Soviet Union, especially strong in the Baltic republics. This was a demonstration in Tallinn in 1989. So things were brewing, and Glasnost was bringing them all out into the open. Ultimately, it helped to end the Soviet bloc, too. Y'all will recognize the Berlin Wall, I'm sure. This was a really interesting case study. I won't go into too much depth here, but I will say CI estimates during this period increasingly took the position that the Russians, i.e. Gorbachev, was very, very unlikely to authorize forceful retention of East European countries in the Soviet bloc. What do I mean by that? Would they invade, as they had done in Hungary in 1956 and in Czechoslovakia in 1968, if they drifted away from Moscow? Our answer at the time, our analytic answer was no. They're not going to do it as long as they continue to call themselves nominal communists. That gives us the fig leaf to not have to go in there and engage in mayhem to retain their loyalty. And the final proof came in 1989 when the Berlin Wall finally did come down. So thinking about the big picture, taking into account Gorbachev's record on political and economic reforms, on Glasnost, on ethnic grievances, so what? This is a slightly longer quote that I think encapsulates the so what, at least as it pertains to the subject of my talk, the gradual but sudden collapse of the Soviet Union. In the summer of 1987, we published an assessment, and the subhead of this section of the assessment was the consequences of failure for Gorbachev. The risks that Gorbachev is taking will give his opponents a platform on which to stand. Gorbachev's position could also be undermined by the loosening of censorship, Glasnost, and the promotion of limited democracy. If it suspects that this process is getting out of control, the party could well execute an abrupt about-face, discarding Gorbachev along the way. The emphasis I added to that. So that's pretty stark. And even in 1987, we were seeing signs and considering the possibility that these reforms would go so belly up for Gorbachev that they created such risks for him, stepping out on that ledge without a safety net. No guarantee of success, in fact, far from it, that he risked being removed from office, being retired. He didn't have to die to leave. So let's circle back to where I began my talk. Back to August 1991, a group of senior leaders in the Politburo and in the military and security agencies grouped together. They decided enough was enough. The experiment with reform had gone on long enough. So they launched what may have been the worst coup ever. Do you remember these guys? Anybody remember this? It didn't last very long, so you might have blotted it out of your memory to make room for more important things. But these were three of the main conspirators. There were five in this executive committee for state preservation. I forget now what I called it. State Committee of Emergency. You may remember seeing video of them giving press conferences. One guy, his hands were shaking. Another guy was clearly drunk, when he's doing his spiel into the microphone. These guys were not serious people, and they were really, really bad at cooing. Okay? Remember this guy? Remember this picture? Excuse me. The plotters were easily upstaged by Boris Yeltsin. He generated immediate resistance to the coup. Huge mistake that they made. They didn't arrest Yeltsin, or worse. They didn't cut off communications to the outside. There were so many things they didn't do. This thing was a failure before it even got off the ground. Yeltsin was the right guy to stand up and challenge the coup plotters at the time. But remember what I said earlier about his and Gorbachev's rivalry. They had become not quite mortal enemies, but they fundamentally disagreed on what the future should bring. Excuse me, one sec. Sorry about that. Yeltsin had an agenda that did not mesh with Gorbachev's. Gorbachev was desperate. He would do anything to keep the Soviet Union united. And during the last year of his tenure, he pulled out all the stops to draft and promulgate a union treaty that would keep all 15, easy for me to say, constituent republics as part of the Soviet Union. Oh, thank you, Bob. Yeltsin took advantage of the disarray after the coup, as well as the urge for independence among the other Soviet republics. Gorbachev fought it for a few months, but by December he realized the jig was up. There was no way he could successfully preserve the Soviet Union, and that was the end of it. He gave up in December 1991. Just an interesting little footnote here, an ad lib. Am I okay on time? Anybody here ever participate in a war game or a simulation, a tabletop war game or simulation? Yeah, a few hands going up. We did them all the time, trying to game out Soviet behaviors. And, you know, they were interesting exercises. This one that I'm about to mention was interesting, but only in hindsight. We did a thing where Gorbachev, an analyst playing Gorbachev, was trying desperately to preserve the Soviet Union. I was playing Yeltsin. The Russia Republic team got together beforehand and huddled. What approach are we going to take to this? And we decided, you're going to play Yeltsin as a bad person. And I was very bad. I did not cooperate on any initiative that the player doing Gorbachev offered. Anything he suggested, no matter how conciliatory, I rejected it, I ignored it, I didn't show up. I'd send a minion to talk to him, which was insulting, of course, to the point where by the end of the simulation, the actor playing Gorbachev was so peeved at me that he was shouting at me and turning red, and tears were streaming down his eyes. The Politburo overthrew him in the simulation. I thought that was really kind of cool. And when I think about it now, I think, wow, we kind of had it right, didn't we? How about that? Okay, enough of my personal back patting here and my acting career. So now there were 15 new countries. I'm in the home stretch, I promise. 15 new countries after the coup. And so 15 new countries created virtually overnight. However, many of them with the same authoritarian leaders that had been in charge before. Maybe the exception is Shevardnadze. Some of you may recognize him on the far left there, the president of Georgia. He was a relatively reformist character, but the rest of these guys were just corrupt bandits, including this one. Okay, so 15 new countries. So the old challenges persisted, but now multiplied by 15. Think about that for a second. There were authoritarians in charge with kind of these associated reformist, democratizing movements that couldn't unite around anything. Economic challenges that had been there before, they didn't get better. when the Soviet Union broke up. And in fact, they got much, much worse. Currencies were devalued. Inflation was rampant. It was a very crazy time to be a part of the Soviet Union. Russian interference, this became a more pronounced thing as Russia grappled with what is our role going to be in this new configuration of states, this new community of states. They settled on something, and they've been honing it ever since. Putin is the master. If there are Russians on the other side of a border, in Kazakhstan, in Estonia, in Ukraine, for instance, they're our problem. And if they have problems with the local authorities, we have the right to go in and help them solve those problems. So lots of interference, Russian interference in their neighboring states really jumped up after this. And the ethnic disputes, like the economy, they didn't get better. They only got worse. Things that had been simmering for a while really boiled over in many ways. And then there were new challenges as well. Nation building. Ever think about how do you build a country from scratch? You've got boundaries. You might have a government, but how do you govern when you're not dependent on Moscow to tell you what to do? And think about it now. These countries have only been countries for 30 years now. Think about where the United States was when it was 30 years old. Had we gotten it right? Have we gotten it right yet? This is not something that you can just snap your fingers or wave a magic wand. Security guarantees. How do you establish what the rules of the road are between these states? Who gets the nukes? That's the biggest security question. That was resolved pretty quickly. At the time of the breakup, there were nuclear weapons in Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan. All but Belarus gave them to Russia. Belarus kept them, but Russia still has control over those nukes. So really, they were all consolidated under Russian control, in case you were worried about Belarus having nukes. And managing their resources. Some of these countries, especially in Central Asia and the Caucasus, in the Caspian region, are sitting on oceans of oil and gas. And competition to control those resources, precious metals, rare metals, things like that in other countries. Who takes charge of that? How do you work that out? How do you work out the competition between Exxon from the West, for instance, and Gazprom in Russia, competing over building gas pipelines, determining the routes and things like that? So enormous, enormous complexities. Managing foreign relations. This is my last point on this one. Some of these, Russia had a Ministry of Foreign Affairs with a lot of seasoned diplomats. Ukraine had quite a few diplomats too. But everybody else was starting from scratch. How do you train a Tajik to be a diplomat like that? You are going to be our ambassador to the United States. That's a real conundrum. Interestingly, it also presented a challenge to the United States because now we had to find ambassadors and chargés d'affaires for 15 countries, whereas we'd only had to do one before. We had to create staffs, diplomatic staff, intelligence officers being dispatched to most, if not all, of these countries. The first time I met the ambassador to Ukraine in 1991, late 1991, his office was his hotel room. That was it. I mean, it was by their shoestrings. So really complex issues that had to be sorted out. So the collapse really created huge, huge challenges. So in conclusion, was this a revolution, the collapse of the Soviet Union? They'd been through a few of them. Or was it something else? I think it's something else. I really do think it's more of a blip on a long continuum of Russian and Soviet and now Russian history again. There's a lot of continuity throughout Russian history. I'm really partial. If you're looking for a good book on Russian history, I highly recommend one called The Story of Russia by Orlando Figes, Figes, who sees the Soviet collapse not as a revolution, but as an abdication of power by the Communist Party. And I think that's really shorthand for Mikhail Gorbachev. I like his book because he agrees with me on almost everything. So take that as with a grain of salt. There was no strong shift to democracy after the collapse of the Soviet Union, far from it. And the only thing I'll say about what played out in Russia after that, Yeltsin started out, with his big Democrat hat. He was bringing in Western advisors. How do I run an economy? How do I do a Western-style economy? Things like that. But really, the authoritarian impulse in Yeltsin was very, very strong. He gave way to a lot of temptations that he didn't have to give way to. His incredibly severe alcoholism and other problems, health problems, didn't help. And in many ways, going from Yeltsin to Putin is, again, part of that continuum. The authoritarian structures that we see now kind of cemented in place, their roots are in Yeltsin's administration. The oligarchy that we see today running Russia was put in place by Yeltsin. So not a whole lot of difference there. And there's a reason why Yeltsin chose Putin. He's the guy who promised not to prosecute Yeltsin and his family for corruption when he retired. Okay, so in the end, really, the Soviet Union just kind of collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. Kind of a sad story there, not sexy, it just imploded. And it was aided, given a shove by Gorbachev's well-intended, but in the end, half-baked reforms. So that ends my presentation. I will ask, are there any questions?